So this is Beatty Park. This area here, really, it's not a place where you think to bring visitors who come to Helena to visit, family or whatever, but this is really one of my favorite places because I think there are original things here that remind us how important the railroad was. If you can just imagine on a June morning in 1883, when that very first locomotive pulled up, it was a construction locomotive that came from Winston. And people all over town were so excited. By the hundreds, they hiked Mount Helena very early and watched for those wisps of smoke from the locomotive. And people were just crowded all over down here. There were vendors selling peanuts, there were wagons, there were people on horseback, there were people on foot, there were people in wagons, just people everywhere. And when that locomotive pulled into the station, the makeshift station, for the first time, I mean, you could hear the screams everywhere. People up on Mount Helena were cheering. It was just something that was really even more exciting than statehood because it really put Helena on the map. It linked us to outside markets. It allowed people to travel at all times of the year when they never could before. And people could go to Chicago or New York and come back before their neighbor even knew they were gone, It was an incredible convenience for everybody. So this area is really important because of that. But it's also important architecturally, and it's important, I think, aesthetically too. Beatty Park was created in 1929, and people made fun of Helena's Depot area. They said it was the worst looking place on the entire Northern Pacific line because the buildings were abandoned. There were buildings all over this little square here, and you can see that would be this area here, and you can see even in I think this is 1892. By 1892, there were buildings all over the place. There was a boot shop, there was a couple of boarding houses, restaurants, saloons, all kinds of different businesses were here. But by the 1920s, mostly they had decayed and been abandoned. So one of the first investors here in this area was Alexander Beatty, and he really believed in this area. He believed, along with others, that this was going to become the new downtown. And they had no idea in 1883 where the capital was going to be. But this was a rather strategic location, and so the depot was decided to be built here. It's a mile from downtown, and it caused the first taxi service to be enacted, and it was if you know down on the gulch, that yellow trolley, that's the kind of trolley service there was. It was a taxi service originally. For 10 cents you could ride that yellow trolley between the depot and the hotels downtown, the nice hotels. So people, came back and forth. It really wasn't a terrible inconvenience to have it a mile away from the downtown area, but there was a lot of hope that this would become a new downtown. So Alexander Beatty invested quite a lot of money. He built the what was the Grand Pacific Hotel. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but down there at the end of the Larson block. And it was a very nice hotel, and he put a lot of money into it. So anyway, Alexander Beatty died. He was a Civil War hero. He was wounded 3 different times in 3 different battles, and married a woman who was way younger than he was, and the family didn't like that. They thought she was a gold digger. So Alexander died not too long after he invested in these properties here, and his wife should have inherited everything, but the brothers sort of ganged up on her and sort of tricked her into signing over her inheritance, really. And so she married again someone else, and that's a whole nother story. But Alexander Beatty, anyway, was an investor here, and his two brothers, Edward and George, were developers also. And so when all three brothers had died, they still had sisters left in Ohio, and the sisters wanted to give $10,000 to the city of Helena for a good purpose that would create a beauty spot somewhere. So the city decided that the $10,000 would be well spent right here, and that's what they did. They created a beauty spot, and the depot area by 1930 was transformed and was no longer made fun of. So who knows what happened here in 1935? Does everybody know? We had devastating earthquakes. It probably damaged the 6th Ward, probably more than anywhere else in Helena. There was a lot of damage down here. And it's really interesting. If you look at the wall here on the depot, the present depot, you can see where the replacement bricks were added. This whole wall, the upper portion fell out. And you can see where the bricks are different and where they repaired it. It's a really good place to see earthquake damage today. There's not a lot of places where you can still see it because a lot of facades were plastered over, you know. So anyway, this is a really good example. But this depot, this is the second depot that was built in 1903, 1904. Charles A. Reed was the architect. His firm of Stem and Reed later were the architectural firm that designed New York's Grand Central Station. So were pretty well known. And it's sort of Italian Renaissance style, but it has a wonderful clock that still works. Somebody showed me the interior workings of the clock, and it's really pretty fantastic. There's a room up there where they go and they set it and fix it. So this is the Drake Hotel. This is the Drake Hotel, which was originally the Grand Pacific. And if you look at the corner, the lower portion is almost the same as it was when this photograph was taken. There were two upper stories that fell in the earthquake, and until the 1935 earthquakes, there were a number of businesses. What's now the Larson Block was a number of individual buildings, and after the earthquakes, the Larson family acquired the property and sort of encapsulated everything and made it into sort of one long block. But they were originally individual businesses. And I mean, they're still individual businesses, but they're not, you know, they're not separate. So to me, this little block right here is the most important part, because these are original wooden false fronted buildings. You know, the whole downtown was originally false fronted buildings like this. And this is the last stretch that exists in Helena. A lot of people don't think it's very attractive, but I think it's just the coolest thing because not all communities have these wooden false fronts left. When the railroad came, most places remodeled and got these big plate glass windows and storefronts, which is what happened down on the Gulch. But for some reason, you know, these were pretty much left intact. The street here was never paved until 1915. There were street lights that were added in 1915, and if you look through these photographs, you'll see that there are three different types of street lighting. And I'm not sure what the time periods are for the different ones, but there were three different types. The first one's added in 1915. This is the last stretch of brick paved streeting and the last stretch of embedded trolley tracks that exist in Helena today. Both of these two end buildings were boarding houses in the upper stories. You know, this was a place where the train crews came through. They had to stop over sometimes. There were lots of men who worked on the railroad and needed places to stay. So as we walk around to the back, you'll see how these places were added on and added on and added on as they needed more and more room. HAPS is kind of an exception here because It's a later building. It wasn't built until about 1916. It was built as a beer parlor and a restaurant. And when Prohibition then outlawed, you know, that kind of thing in 1919, this became a restaurant in the front, but Hap's always had a back room where you could always get a drink. It was, I guess you would call it a speakeasy, but Hap's really never did close. And right as soon as Prohibition ended in 1933, it became what it is now. So that's kind of cool too. I think also one of the really special places in this neighborhood is this little house right here. If you look at the 1884 Sanborn map, this is the 1892, but if you look at the 1884 one, it's there, and it's marked public wash house. And it's a place where there was a well, and the crews could come there and wash up, and probably they needed to wash up. And so by 1888, it was the dwelling that you see here. The Capitol Hotel was next door, and it was completely destroyed in the earthquakes, but there's a good photograph of it before, I think. Here is the little house, and here's the Capitol Hotel right here, right after the earthquakes. So it got some craftsman style decorations on it, but the house itself is really quite historic, and I think it's really pretty cool. So when the Northern Pacific was built across the Northwest from St. Paul to Portland in 1881 to 3, there were 17,000 Chinese workers that were imported that were brought in to lay the tracks, along with a number of Italian workers and Irish workers. But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed, it was a federal law that was passed in 1882, just after they gathered all these Chinese workers, workers could no longer come into the United States from China. And so with the next building of the next railroad, the Great Northern, they used Japanese labor. And the same with 1910, when the line was refurbished all across the Northwest, it was Japanese workers that did a lot of that labor. And we know that from looking at the 1910 census here for Helena, there were a number of buildings that aren't here anymore in between the railroad tracks. There were warehouses, and there was a roundhouse, and there were also boxcars where dozens and dozens and dozens of Japanese workers were living. In this house here, this started out as a meat market in the downstairs, and it was a boarding house upstairs, but by the 1940s it was home to the Rinzo Ogata family, and he was the Japanese consul here for Lewis and Clark County during World War II. And he had a very large family. Unfortunately, he was killed in a car accident in 1948, I believe. But his family lived here in the house through the 1940s, and they had a dairy farm actually, and they did quite a lot of farming, and possibly they did truck gardening. You probably heard stories about the Japanese gardens. And they did grow gardens and things down here. They would haul water from the spring, which is where Helena High School is. Helena High School still floods in the basement because of the spring that's there. And that's where they would get the water to irrigate or to water their gardens. So this was known as the Benson Carpenter warehouse. And it started out as a warehouse for storing agricultural implements in the 1890s. And it's really cool because you can read the historic layers in this building. As I say, it was built in about 1894 or so, and the original building was the stone portion. But then gradually they added things onto it. We always have preservation questions about whether should you remove those historic layers and bring it back to its original stone appearance, or should you leave those layers there so it, you know, tells its history? And it's just, you know, it's kind of a quandary, and different people think you should do different things. You actually have railroad tracks here where the siding, the rail siding, went up to the side of the warehouse, and they could ship things out and bring heavy equipment in that way. Somebody actually lives there now. For a while, this was going to become a microbrewery, and during that period, must have been the late 1990s, I happened to get a tour of the building, and one of the most exciting things happened. In one of the beams, overhead beams, there's a penciled signature, and I don't know if anybody knows who Hugh Kirkendall was, but he was a very famous teamster, and he did all of the hauling for the, when they built the dams. He brought in all of the heavy equipment by horse and mule, and he apparently brought in all of the beams for this building, and his penciled signature is there on one of the beams, which is so cool. But I really love this part here because it shows the rural character of Helena. You have these wonderful outbuildings that probably originally held horses. So this little house, is everybody familiar with Lewis Reeder? Reeder's Alley? Lewis Reeder was the builder of this little house here as a rental property. Again, you know, he invested in this area too. Unfortunately, he died in 1884, but before he died, he built this little house as a rental, and so it dates to 1883, to the very early time period when, you know, the trains first came through. And here you can see what's happened to the back of this boarding house. It's just added on to about 3 different times. As they needed, you know, more space to house workers, they just kept adding on and adding on. So that's a really good example right there. And you can see the false front from here. You guys know why they built false fronts? False fronts in the gold camps. You've been to Virginia City, there are original false fronts there. And you know, people were very nervous about living in a place that was so remote. And so they would build false fronts because they made the buildings look much bigger and grander than they really were. So it was a sense of security, you know, false security really. You can kind of imagine how these were actually separate buildings at one time. You know, you can see where kind of see where the seams are. I think originally they were wooden, not brick. So the brick facing is probably post-earthquake, when they were, you know, when it was sort of made to look like one continuous building. Where the Friendship Center is today, when this district was listed, there was a priest's residence that went with the church here. We'll talk about it in a minute. But the priest's residence dated to 1916, and it was actually moved to a location outside of East Helena where people are still living in the house. It's good that they didn't tear it down, but moving it from its context was not the best thing. And unfortunately, it happened right after the district was listed. So it sort of did take a primary resource away from the National Registered District. This church, I think, has probably the most surprising architectural history of any place in the district, maybe of any place in Helena actually, because this little church was built in 1910 as the church attached to St. Mary's Parish. And it was built at the same time as St. Charles Hall at Carroll College, and at the same time as the cathedral, designed by the same architect as the Cathedral of St. Helena. He was a very well-known institutional architect who, you know, you look at what he did with the Cathedral of St. Helena, I mean, it's an absolutely gorgeous cathedral. But you look at what he did here, he was very, very careful to design something that fit in a blue-collar neighborhood. He didn't design a big fancy church because that wouldn't have fit here, you know. This was for the parishioners that would have frequented this church. And the Cathedral of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary was Helena's first cathedral before St. Helena. And it was over on Catholic Hill, over by where the fire tower is. And there was a bell tower. It was an outside wooden structure with a bell on it, in it. And that was moved here. And that church was decommissioned, or whatever you call it, when Cathedral of St. Helena was first used in 1914. So they brought the bell from the decommissioned cathedral here, and it sat here until the new St. Mary's was built. And the new St. Mary's, the bell is over there today, and that's the original bell that was in the yard of the first cathedral. This is now Christian school, I think. But it is really important architecturally because it is, evidence that this architect who designed those two really beautiful buildings could also design something to fit in a blue-collar neighborhood. So do you guys see the car barns down there, and they're painted brown and there's a green top? Yeah. All right, that is a piece of the original depot, which on the cover of this, you have a picture right here. This is the first depot that was built in 1883. This depot was moved over here. We're going to go look at the main part of the building here in a second. But that green paint is the original Northern Pacific colors and the original green paint from this depot. So this building here was the original Northern Pacific Depot, and architecturally it's really important because it doesn't look anything like it looks in this picture. It's been radically changed, but the core of the building is the depot, and it was designed by Cass Gilbert, who was the designer of the Montana Club. And he's a very famous, nationally known architect who also designed the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., and other really important buildings. But he designed 3 depots along the Northern Pacific line in 1885 or so, at the very beginning of his career, and this is the only one of the 3 that's still standing. And it was moved here to make room for the other depot that was built in 1904, 1903, 1904. And once it was moved here, it became the Presbyterian Church, which is why it has a steeple on it that was added when it became a church. And through the teens, it was the Presbyterian Church, and then it became a rug factory into the 1920s, and then it finally became the apartment building that it is today. And you can see, it's stuccoed on the front, so you can't see the original shiplap siding, but you can see it on the side, and that is the original siding in the back there. I've been told that the ticket office was, if you go through that archway at the back portion of the building is where the ticket office was. They took a piece of the building and cut it off to make those into car barns. So it's really, really hard to tell, from looking at the photograph, what exactly you're looking at, which piece of it. But it's pretty cool that it's preserved. And it has an interesting history too, of use, adaptive reuse. So that sort of concludes my tour.